Hello there. This is the second in a series of kind of little short AdLib lessons that I'm trying to do this year. So last time we did what I recommend for like the ultimate beginner to start with, and that was very digital focused. This one's a bit more general. And today we're going to be looking at shading. So the first thing I wanted to do is differentiate shading from lighting. So the first thing I should explain is I have a very kind of unorthodox and unique kind of structure that I use for shading and lighting. I differentiate shading and lighting. So for me, shading is anything that just includes the light source and the geometry, and that will be shading. And lighting is anything that includes the light source, geometry, so same as shading, but also the actual rays, particles, photons, whatever you want to call them, and also the camera. So we start with just the two elements here, and then we add another two when we look at lighting to make 4 elements. But today we're just going to be looking at shading. So that's kind of the way I differentiate the two. I'm not sure how everyone else does, but for me that is the difference between shading and lighting. One is purely a geometrical process, or whatever you want to call it, geometrical mechanics. It's just purely looking at where the light source is and the actual geometry. And another one is more of a simulation of actual light rays, and it also takes the camera into account, because obviously there's things that the camera will see differently. You know, a camera that's over here will see the reflection on here on the box, but the camera that's up here, the reflection will move to there, right? So there's a lot of, even though they're the same elements, they will be in a different position on the geometry from what the camera can see, depending on where the camera is, if that makes sense. So that's kind of another difference you can think about is when you're looking at lighting, where things look like they are on the geometry will move, but in shading it doesn't matter where the camera looks at it from. This surface will always be the same value, so nothing changes. It's almost as if in shading you could paint the lighting directly onto the scene, like some old video games do. But in lighting you couldn't paint a specular reflection onto the scene, onto the actual geometry, onto the surface of it, because the specular reflection needs to move. Okay. So we're looking at shading and the structure of shading as well. I have kind of a different way of seeing it. So let me just change to the pen tool because it's a bit easier to write stuff down. So in shading, I kind of split shading itself up into 2 categories as well, and that's your your actual shadows. So that's shadow versus light area, which a lot of people talk about. I'm sure most people watching this video will know. And also your half tones. Right, and just bear in mind, as I've already said a few times, I see things in a quite unorthodox manner, different to how many other artists see, so this might not be compatible with what you see in other areas, but this is the way it kind of makes sense to me mechanically. So our shadows and lights, what we're really looking at is the actual shadow, and we split it into 2 types of shadow. So this is going to split down into 2 series again, and we're going to have form shadow and cast shadows. And then halftone itself also splits down into another 2 categories, and that's going to be angle and occlusion. So light and shadow, I'm sure, are pretty easy to figure out, and I'm sure most people know that just off the bat. That's just where the light is hitting on the object and where it isn't. So if this light's hitting here, these two surfaces are in light, this one's in shadow. That's it. It's just black and white, binary. That's it. Literally black and white, on or off. Are you seeing the light or are you not seeing the light? Even if we're looking at a curved surface, right, with a light shining down on it, when we're talking about shadow and light, we are drawing a line and saying, you know, if I was a bacteria, if I was like a bacteria on the surface right there, I wouldn't be seeing the light and would be receiving no light, completely black. But if I was a piece of bacteria on the surface here, I would indeed be able to see the light if I looked up, you know, if bacteria had eyes. A lot of people say ant as well. And then secondly, and a little bit more complicated, is halftone, and that involves angle and occlusion. So again, I see this slightly different to other artists. Other artists wouldn't lump occlusion into halftone, but I do, because occlusion only works in the light, right? Occlusion is where light is being cut out from an area. Most people will say occlusion only happens in the shadows. My model disagrees. And what halftone is basically anything that will make this light area get darker, right? Not to become shadow, but anything that just makes it slightly darker. So anything that makes it not direct light, basically. So obviously angle works, right? So you know, if I have two planes that can see the light here, because this one's angled down a bit, it won't be in shadow, but it will be slightly darker. And occlusion, as I'm sure a lot of us know, is kind of like in the crevices where things get darker, and we'll explain that more. It's not just in the crevices, but that's the most common kind of example that people use. So we've got shadow and light, which is binary, on or off, can it see the light or not? And we've got halftone, which is anything that makes a light area slightly darker. So let me do a demonstration for you guys to kind of help explain this. And I've had a go at sort of doing these things in my own time, so I've got sort of a vague idea of how to demonstrate this. So say we've got 4 panels here, and obviously this one, so these two are going to be our shadows, and these two are going to be our halftones. And we're going to have our form shadows, our cast shadows, and then we're going to have our angles, or our angle halftone, and our occlusion halftone. So we're going to be looking at a ball on a plane. So that's what we've got, a ball on a plane, and that's enough to demonstrate every single kind of shading that we're looking at today. And I should mention, so the light source is coming from the top down in all of these demonstrations, directly from the top down, so simple as possible. And in shading, for the model that I use, we're going to assume that the light illuminates everything by default. So the light is going through all of the geometry, it's lighting up everything, and that's why it's just a big white, you know, overexposed shape. The light is currently hitting everything, and we call it shading, or at least I call it shading, because all we're looking at is the shadows, okay? Everything starts as light by default, and we're just introducing the shadows. All right. So the shadows that we're going to see from our form, we've got our ball here, and what's going to happen is the light is going to be visible from everything that's even slightly facing up on the ball, and it's not going to be visible on anything on the bottom of the ball. So that's our form shadow. All we're demonstrating there is the form shadow. That's it. So you can see all that's happened is the form of our ball has turned away, and like I said earlier, or similar to what I said earlier, if we've got an ant here, he's going to be seeing the light. And if we've got an ant here, he's not going to be seeing any light, right? And we're not worrying about the ant that's here until the next stage, because that would be a cast shadow, right? Which is what I'm about to show you. So now we're going to look at the cast shadows, and you see I've duplicated what we've got so far over here. And we're going to add the cast shadows, and I'm just going to get this out of the way quickly because I'm sure most people know pretty much what I'm going to do here. And I'm just going to add the cast shadow under the ball. Okay. So that one's pretty simple. The form and the cast shadows, they're super easy. Like I said, these are the less complicated ones, and these are the more complicated ones down here. And again, just to kind of demonstrate, the ant that's here, he can see the light source, but the ant that's here, when he looks up, he can just see the ball, right? So that's how that's going to work. And this is assuming that the light source is an infinitely small point. And that's a very important thing that I just mentioned there. So if we move on to the next one, and again, I've just copied it over for us. Now we're looking at angle. So again, the light can be an infinitely small point, and that's going to be really important for the occlusion. But right now, the light is still an infinitely small point. And what's going to happen with angle, again, I'm sure a lot of people can kind of guess what's going to happen here. What we're not going to do is that, because that's eating into the shadow. And remember, the shadow can't see the light at all. It's only going to be affected where the light hits, right? So right here, where the ball is slightly angled from the light, it's just going to be a little bit darker, right? And that's actually going to be a smooth gradient. So what you can do if you really want is actually represent that as a gradient that's going all the way, you know, up to the brightest part. And that's going to be angle. And you notice I didn't touch the plane either because that's all at the same angle. But if you was being really pedantic, you could say that as the plane gets more towards the edges here, it's still going to get dark because if I draw a diagram for you guys, if I have the light source here and I have the plane here, and I'm stretching reality a little bit, this isn't completely accurate. The light looking at this center point, right, the angle is 0. But if I look at the light that's coming out to these edges, you can see that there is actually an angle. Even if, you know, the plane is still facing the same way. Because the light is now, you know, off to the side. And the further off to the side, right, you can imagine the more angle there's going to be on this point source. If the light was an infinite source, just shining down, then yeah, there's not going to be any angle. So that's why the corners of this square, I shouldn't have done that with the blur brush, but that's why the corners of this square are still going to be very, very slightly darker in this example. Although, like I said, that's not hugely important. That's still being just a little bit pedantic for this demonstration here. Okay, so that's angle. And you can see it looks a little bit more realistic still. You can see each time we upgrade our complexity in the shading, it becomes more realistic, right? Okay, so on to the next one. And this is going to be the final one even. Occlusion. Now this is the one that a lot of people get hung up on, and I'm just trimming the shadow down here to make it a little bit more accurate and make it easier for me to demonstrate this for you guys. But just pretend all of them have the shadow in this kind of shape. Okay, so occlusion. This is going to be the tough one to explain, and the tough one for people to understand, really. So let me try and draw a diagram for you guys. So far, this light source that we've been imagining, it's actually an infinitely small point. It's just a dot, right? But occlusion is going to happen only when the light source actually is, you know, a particular size. So let's pretend this light source is actually beach ball shaped. It's not an infinitely small point. This one is actually a light source, right? And what occlusion is if I have my plane here, right, all of that can see the light source, okay? And if I have like a ball here, like I said, half of that can't see the light source, okay? What occlusion is is something of an area in between. So what it's going to be is anything that is here, right? If I put my ant or bacteria, whatever you want to call it, right there, and it's looking directly up, what's going to happen is, and I'm going to draw its view, right? So this is the ant's view. I hope this makes sense. And the ant is looking straight up from this plane. What it's going to see is this massive light source. But what it's also going to see is at the side of its view, it's going to be seeing the bottom of this ball here, right? So it's just going to be seeing this ball blocking, basically partially blocking the view of the light source. And that's actually going to diminish how much light is in this spot. So it's not in shadow because it can still see the light source, but because the light source has some angular size where it can see the light source, that can actually be partially blocked. And that's why it can't happen with a point light source that's literally just a tiny little speck, is because at that point either the light source is being covered or it's not. As soon as the light source has some size, some mass, some area, it is like angular area, I think it's called, or something like that, that's when occlusion can happen. Okay? And that's the simplest way that I can explain occlusion. I haven't seen anyone else explain it quite like that, but that is definitionally what occlusion is. Anything that comes under that kind of category is occlusion. And like I said, it's something that is still seeing the light. It's part of the form that is still seeing the light, but it's just being partially blocked. So if we look at our diagram that we did earlier, we want to ask ourselves now, what areas are going to be in occlusion? So what areas are going to be a spot where we can see the light source that's shining down from above, but not completely? And again, it's going to be the same as in this diagram. It's going to be right there. Okay? So when this ant looks up in the sky, it can see this part of the sphere blocking its view. I hope that makes sense. And that means that this ant is going to be seeing slightly less light than this ant. This ant is going to be seeing the entire light source. This ant is going to be seeing only part of the light source. Okay, so let's represent that. What it's going to be is, and a lot of people, when I started learning the fundamentals, this was something that I always wondered why, and now I finally understand it. This is going to be why the edges of your shadows are going to be soft. That's how that's going to be represented on our model. So that's actually occlusion. And most artists, like I said, I have a very unorthodox view of it, and it's different to a lot of artists. Most artists wouldn't class this softening, I don't think so anyway. Most artists, I don't think, would class the edges of the shadows softening as occlusion, but I would. Okay, and it's not actually the edges of the shadows softening, it's actually the light parts leading up to the shadow that are getting more and more occluded by the sphere. And just to explain that again, so an ant here, so an ant that stood here is going to be seeing no light. An ant that stood here is going to be seeing the light source. And remember, this is a bigger light source now than we've really looked at earlier. But it's going to be occluded by the edge of the sphere. And the ant that's standing here is going to be seeing the full light source. And the ant that's standing over in this corner is going to be seeing the full light source, but it's at an angle. So the angle is going to make it slightly dimmer. Okay, I hope that explains everything. And you see that now we have the, especially if I kind of, if I make this just a little bit heavier on the angle, you can see that this sphere is actually the most realistic one, and then it gets slightly less realistic, slightly less realistic, slightly less realistic. But that is the four things, the four mechanics that we're going to be looking at in shading. And that's the best way I can kind of demonstrate them. The only thing I didn't explain is the why an angle, why a surface at an angle is going to be slightly dimmer. So if I quickly explain that and jump backwards a little bit and digress. If we have the light source here, you know, we've got a flat plane. It's all about the area, the volume of light. We're thinking about the ant that's on the light source. So if we put an ant on the light source, he's seeing a pretty big, you know, his view from the light source is going to be straight on. It's going to be this flat, big plane. But if he's looking at an angled light source instead, so we put our ant on the light again, and if he's looking at an angled, so the same size plane, but this one's at an angle, what our ant is going to be seeing now is going to be thinner, right? So he's going to be looking at something like that. Does that make sense? When he looks down at that angled plane, that's what he's going to see. And you'll notice that this has all of this surface area for the light to land on. But this one is kind of dodging it. There's loads of light going out here, right? There's less wasted light going on the sides there. And that's why when the plane is at an angle, it's going to be slightly darker. Hi there, just to interject, this is post-editing Lewis here, to inform you that I actually forgot one thing, and that's that there's actually 3 types of halftone. The third being the distance from the light source, so fall off is the third type of halftone. And I put this interjection here because it works exactly the same as angle. You see on angle it's actually darker because if you look from the light source, the surface looks slightly smaller and there's less of the light falling on it. It's exactly the same for the fall off or distance. You know, as things get further away from you, they get smaller in your view. So of course they're also going to get darker comparatively to the light source. Very basic, doesn't really take much to teach, which is why I kind of forgotten about it and left it out here. But basically, as the surface gets further away from the light source, it's going to get darker. Thank you. Okay, so that's all of the mechanics, and I hope I also explained why all of the mechanics work the way they do, which I think is really an important part of understanding things, and especially if you're going to be painting from imagination, sorry, it's really important to actually know, you know, not just how these mechanics work, especially in shading, but why. Okay, hopefully that explains that pretty well. So we're going to look at some other examples here that aren't set in space with no ambient occlusion, with no external light sources. We're going to look at some slightly more complicated scenarios. So at this point, I've kind of already taught the entire lesson, but we're just going to look at, like I said, some other examples and scenarios of how things can work. So the first scenario that we're going to see sometimes, we're going to do the ball on a plane again, but and with the light source. Sorry, I just switched from the pen to the paintbrush, and we're going to be looking at the beach ball light source, but we're also going to have an extra light source, and this is a very common one. If you think of the beach ball as kind of like the sun is more of a point source, but think of the sun as a bit larger here, just to bend the rules. We're also going to be having an extra light source, which is going to be like a dome, you know, like a skybox in a video game. So this is a dome, and the ball is inside the dome, and the dome is shining light on the inside from every single angle. So it's a skybox. Basically, it is the sky. This ambient light is representing, which it does take the form of a dome around us that's just shining light in from all angles. So if we get the background value in here, then we're going to have the ball and the plane, and remember everything starts off being completely lit in my version of shading, in my you know, in the mechanics of how the shading works in my head. Everything starts off as completely lit, overexposed, the light is touching everything, and now what we're doing is called shading. So we're shading, we're adding the shadows, right? So we're going to have, like I said, we're setting up the same thing as earlier, and you can see I used a slightly lighter background. I probably should have in the last demonstrations. Right, we've got our form shadows. We've got our cast shadows. We've got our angle halftone. And we've got our occlusion on the edges of the shadows. And we're just looking at the one light source still for now. We're ignoring the skybox, okay? So that for this beach ball sun, that's what we're looking at, okay? But now we're going to be thinking about the skybox light source. And this is going to be raining in light from everywhere, right? So what's going to happen is all of the shadows are going to become slightly brighter, right? Because there's no area where it's completely dark anymore. So it's just a few values up. And this is just where the light is hitting all of our shadows and brightening them up. The light's hitting everywhere now because of this skybox. But like I said earlier, now we've got to think what areas is our ant going to be able to see. So we're thinking of the skybox now, not the beach ball sun. We've already done the occlusion for the beach ball sun, and that's the softening at the edges of the shadow. We're thinking about which ants are going to be seeing part of the skybox, right? But still having their view occluded. Something's still going to be occluding the skybox. Something's still going to be in the way. And there's only one area where that's going to be. And I'm sure a lot of you already can guess. It's going to be, so if the edge of our ball is going here and it's contacting the plane right there, it's going to be in here. Any ants that are in these areas, right? If I show you what these ants are seeing, and this is going to be kind of difficult, but what these ants are seeing is obviously all of this by default is skybox, so this is just white, what the ant's seeing right now. But what the ant is going to have, you know, occluding its view is going to be the bottom plane, right? So if I'm an ant, if I recreate this plane here, if I'm an ant on this plane, okay, and you've got the ball there, and the ant's looking out this way. So you see when the ant looks out this way, the front of the plane is going to be captured in the ant's view, and that's what this is. But what the ant is also going to have occluding its view is the ball. And I'm not sure exactly how that would look from the ant's view. It's quite hard to imagine, but the ball is basically going to be at the top of the ant's view, right? And this is going to be black, according to the skybox. And this is going to be black. Right, so both of these are occluding the ant's view of, you know, the skybox here. All of this skybox is going to be what the light can see, but you can see it's just that thin shape that the ant can see now. Okay, and if none of the items were there, if none of those objects were there, the ant would just see the entire, you know, its entire view would just be the light source. It would just be the skybox. But what's happening is the ball and the plane are actually occluding the ant's view of the skybox. So I hope that explains why the ant that's in this little crevice here is going to be in a slightly shadowier area. It's seeing just slightly less of that skybox. And of course, the ant that's right here, right where the ball is touching the plane, his view is going to be, you know, the plane itself and then the ball, right? So he's going to be not seeing any light at all, which is why it's going to get slowly darker and darker until we reach, you know, the very bottom of the ball. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to draw it on the plane first, so that all of the ants on the plane, I'm thinking about how much light they're seeing. You can see it's just going to get slightly darker as it gets closer to the bottom of that ball. And that's what most artists would agree with me is, you know, the actual occlusion shadow. That's what most people would call the occlusion shadow. And of course, the ants that are sitting on the ball, they're no different. Their view is also going to be more obstructed in the same or very similar way the closer they get to that little crevice. Okay, so I hope that sort of makes sense, and I hope people can see that on their monitors and on their phones, because that is it's a very small change in value. It might be difficult for some people to see. So there you go. I've just edited it a little bit, so hopefully that's a bit easier for you guys to see and make out. So you can see the area just in that crevice is going to be where the actual occlusion is happening, along with the soft edges of the shadow. And we're going to see the angle right where the form is turning away from the light source. Alright, so I wanted to show you guys another example as well. And this one is going to be the corner, okay? So if we set up our scene again, and I'm going to use the same values as I was before, as I have done here as the new modified values. And what we're going to be looking at now is we're going to be thinking about what happens when we have a plane and a corner right here, and we have our light source. And this is going to be a beach ball light source again, or maybe even it could even work the same with an ambient light source like a skybox or a sky dome, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so we're going to have our corner, right? And we're thinking about what the ants are going to see. Okay, so if we have an ant right here, and he's looking out in that direction generally, realistically the ants are looking in a dome, in like a, the ants are looking out in every direction, but I'm just showing you the important slice of that direction, the slice where the action's actually happening. So we say the ant's looking out here, or that's the view that we're kind of drawing from. What he's going to be seeing is a lot of the sky, right? He's looking out and all he can see is a tiny bit of the, or I don't think it's going to look like that. What he's going to see is the bottom plane, similar to the ant that was sat right in this crevice earlier. He's going to see the bottom of that plane. And if his view is wide enough, right? And if his view is wide enough, so we're going kind of super fisheye lens here. But if he, you know, if he's really looking, you know, far out there, he's even going to start to see, and this is very warped, just remember, this is super duper fisheye. He's going to see some of the top plane as well. But all of this area here is going to be, let's pretend it's not a beach ball. Let's pretend it is the dome type light source. All of that area here is going to be light that the ant's seeing, and the only bits that are going to be blocked from the light or occluded are going to be these bits here. But if the ant walks slightly more towards the corner, right, and he's looking at the same view, and I'll just show you that same kind of distorted vertical slice, what's going to happen is when he looks out, because he's further back, right, he's going to see, if we imagine, this is one ant's view. If this ant walks backwards, what happens is this plane is going to be, larger and larger and larger in its view. So it's going to be slightly larger, this plane is. And also the roof, also the top plane is going to be larger too. And I know that looks strange. It's because we're looking at a super warped view here that, our human eyes wouldn't be used to. But this is like, pretend this is one of those 360 cameras, right? One of those cameras that look in all directions. When you see like the whole view of that, it is very distorted, right? So this is kind of the important parts of the view that ant is going to be seeing. And you can see, obviously, the same sort of principles we've been talking about earlier. This one is seeing a massive area of light, and this one is only seeing, this tiny shape here. There is more of it being occluded. And that is why, I'm sure a lot of people already know this, but I'm explaining not just that it happens, but why it happens. That is why, in the wrong tool. That is why in the crevices, in the corners of things, so if you look in the corners of the walls in your house, you may even notice it's a little bit subtle, but it's going to be darker as it goes towards this corner and more occluded. Even though it's still in the light, even though the ant that's here can still see the light source, because it's right in that corner and its view is being more and more taken up by the planes that it's looking at when it looks out at the world, it's going to be slightly darker and darker. And like I said, it's very subtle, this one. It's quite a subtle effect, at least when it's in a corner. And you can see how that's kind of shaping out to look. I won't render this whole thing, but you can see it's just going to get slightly darker as it goes into the corner. And of course, a lot of people can probably guess, if I look at two planes, that are in a lot more of an acute angle. So if we exaggerate this, the ant that stood there, he's going to be seeing literally like a thin slice of the sky, right? Because the angle is a lot more acute. So that's why things are going to get slightly more darker, slightly more occluded in any kind of corners. And that actually works. Sorry, it's that time of day when the ice cream van comes. And that actually works not just in corners like that, but also, and again, this is just going to be a short demonstration because I'm sure most people get this by now, but it's also going to work in any kind of trench or crevice, okay? So if we have a crevice here, we imagine what the ant here is seeing. Again, if he looks up, what he's basically going to be seeing is the walls either side of him, and then only this bit is going to be lit. And even more so, if he gets in the corner, it's just going to be blocked even more on one side. Okay, and the deeper that trench is, right, if we make that trench super duper deep, okay, I know that's a bit complicated to look at and understand, but just bear with me here. If that trench is super duper deep now, and we put our ant right at the bottom of here, I'm sure you've probably seen that like vertigo effect. It's a little bit similar to that in movies, right? He's going to be seeing like a thin, very thin sliver of sky, and here is just going to be the walls that are just going to be dark. It's the same like if you imagine the ant that's sitting in the well, right? So if we have a well here the ant that's sitting in the well and looking up, pretend the bucket isn't there, but the ant that's sitting in the well and looking up, right, his view is literally just going to be a little circle at the top. And the deeper he is down that well, the smaller that little circle is going to become until it's just a dot of light. So we might get to a point where the ant isn't technically in shadow, right? Because he can still see that tiny little pinprick of light. He is not technically in shadow. He can still see the light source. But it is so occluded that, you know, it's almost black. It's pretty much he's completely in the dark, and you can just see this tiny little pinprick of light. And that's going to be the same for the ant that's in this little crevice right here, and it's going to be the same for the ant that is all the way in a deep shallow corner. But obviously a corner's, it's never going to be as dark as a 90 degree. You can think of this one like a corner, but it's getting infinitely more acute of an angle. Remember when I said the more acute the angle of that corner, you know, the more steep that angle is, the more of that well effect there is going to be, and the darker it's going to be. So you can think of all of this as the same effect of occlusion, and also the edges of the shadow as being occlusion. So I think that pretty much covers all of it. And the last thing I wanted to show you guys is something that I do often think about, and that's to explain a little bit more, just in case anyone was still a little bit foggy on why the edges of the shadows can be occluded. So if we have a cylinder here and a big plane, and there's a light source, a beach ball type light source, not a point light source, but a beach ball type light source behind this cylinder. Obviously, you know, the cylinder is going to be casting a shadow, right? If we have a little ant here, and he's looking this way, like I said before, the ants are actually looking in every direction at once, but the action is happening where he looks that way. So if we have an ant that's looking that way, and he's walking this way, okay? So we're going to see what the ant's view is looking like. So when the ant's over here, his view is going to be the light, and he's just going to be seeing, you know, his view is only occluded, you know, the time, or let's just say it's not occluded at all, basically. He's just looking at the light, right? He walks over, let me move that arrow. He walks over to like here, okay? And what we get, so he's looking at the light basically. And what we get is, now that he's walked a little bit over, we get what's called a parallax effect, right? And that's something like, you know, if you have like a scenery, like two mountains over each other, that's going to be like, if you're walking this way, this mountain's going to be appearing to move faster than this mountain, right? Because it's further in the background. And in the same way, this sun here, this beach ball light source, is going to be moving that way, right? As the ant walks this way. But it's going to be moving really slow. And if you walk around in real life and look at the sun, don't look at the sun, but you know what I mean. The sun is so far away, it's basically infinite distance. It might as well be, practically. It's not going to move at all as you walk. But if you walk past a building, it's going to move loads, right? So we're going to pretend this cylinder is a building, and we're looking at the sun, although we've enlarged the sun to make it easier to understand this. And the building is just slightly occluding the sun, right? And I'm sure people can tell what's going to happen. The ant walks to like here. His view is going to be a little bit more occluded by the building. The sun is still going to be in the same spot. So it's going to be slightly darker for the ant, and slightly darker, and slightly darker, and slightly darker, until he can't see the sun at all, right? Until the cylinder has completely occluded the sun, right? And that's when he's in shadow, because he can't see the light source anymore, okay? And that's why, not in the shadow, but in the light, it's going to get slightly darker and darker as the ant walks closer to the shadow, and his light, his view of the sun becomes slowly more occluded. And the reason I'm explaining this is because there's actually an effect where, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit more. There's actually an effect where the shadows will become softer and softer and softer, and this is a basic rule in fundamentals. The edges of the shadows, and I'm saying the edges of the shadows, but you know, like I've said a couple of times, it is actually in the light. The edges of the shadows are going to get more and more blurry the further away from the object that's casting. So if I have two scenes, or if I have two planes with two spheres floating above, only one sphere and on the same, you know, with a beach ball sun up here on each, and one sphere is much further away from the plane. This sphere, and I'm sure a lot of people also can kind of guess how this looks in real life, it's going to have a very blurry shadow, right? The only point that it's actually going to be shadow is right there. And the rest of it is just going to be very well, the shadow is going to be the same size, sorry, even. But it's going to be really blurry on the edges, or it's going to look really blurry because there's going to be, the occlusion is going to be much softer. But the ball that's here, the occlusion is going to be, you know, much less soft. Okay? And I'm sure most people have seen that effect before. And it's the same with that cylinder, right? If we have the cylinder, say the light source is coming from here, and it's casting a light source out here, it's going to be blurrier, as I was showing you earlier, on those edges, the further away it is. And right where the shadow is coming up to the cylinder, right there, it's going to be sharp, like pin sharp shadow, razor sharp. Okay? And, excuse me. And that's because if we have an ant here that's walking this way, remember we was talking about the parallax. The closer things are, the faster they seem to move, right? Remember the mountain that's far away and the mountain that's closer? These mountains are moving much faster, right? So what's going to happen is they're going to come and block the sun much faster than these ones in the background. These ones in the background are going to slowly move and slowly block the sun. These ones that are a bit closer to us are going to be moving faster. So if the ant's walking at the same speed, the sun is going to go from being partially blocked to completely blocked in a much shorter amount of time. And if we're talking a mountain range that's really close, you know, if you've ever been in a car driving past a building or walked past a building, you know, it's moving pretty much instantly. It's just going to block the light straight away. So I hope that kind of explains something that I struggle to understand when I first started trying to draw and paint, as to why shadows get softer as they get further away, and how to kind of predict how things will be in these different situations, like where the ball is, you know, closer to the plane or further away from the plane. That is really like the hardest one to this right here is the hardest one to get, in my opinion, and this took me the longest to understand by far, this kind of why, because I always wondered at first, I didn't really understand, like, you know, do shadows get softer the further away they get or closer? And then once I learned that, I was like, but why do shadows seem to have softer edges the further they are from the object that's casting them? Specifically cast shadows this works with, I should mention. And that's why cast shadows will get softer the further away they are from the object. It's due to the parallax against the light source. And the further away object is going to parallax over the light source slower. Excuse me. Then the further away lights, and the further away object is going to parallax over the light source slower than the closer light source. So I hope that makes sense, and that's kind of the last thing I wanted to explain. So just to do a quick recap and summary, shading and lighting in my version of the mechanics are different. Lighting is only including the light source and the geometry. It does not take into account the camera. Wherever the camera is placed, everything's going to look the same. And the size of the light source and the size of the geometry also do matter. And for lighting, that is going to be more like a simulation. We're going to be looking at the rays, photons, ping pong balls, however you want to simulate the light, and also the camera position. So both of those are going to matter in lighting. But today we just looked at shading, which only looks at the geometry and the light source. Okay? And that is split into those two categories. So shadow and light, or just shadow, you can call it, and halftone. Shadow being, can it see the light source at all? That's on off. It's digital. You can see the light or you can't. Even if you can see a pinprick of the light, that is still you seeing the light. And the halftone is anything that is seeing the light, but where the light source is being slightly occluded by an object in the way of its view, the form's view. And as for our two types of shadows, we've got form shadow and cast shadow. Form shadow is going to be where the form turns away, so that's on the edges of an actual form that's turned away, like on the edges of the ball. And cast shadow is going to always be a result of a form shadow, and that's a cutout made by the form shadow that is then cast onto another surface. And where halftone breaks into two different mechanics, we're going to have our angle, which is where a surface is slightly angled away, but it hasn't quite become a form shadow, right? Because it's only slightly angled away. You can still see the light source if you're an ant on the surface of it. And occlusion is going to be, again, similar to cast. So these are directly, I should mention, these are directly linked to each other. The angle is what leads up to a form shadow, and the occlusion is what leads up to kind of a cast shadow. And like I was saying a second ago, occlusion is actually where we can still see the light source, but you know, a slight bit of shadow is being cast onto us, or it's better to think of our view of the light source as being slightly blocked by something, which is kind of the same as a cast shadow when you think about it. So it's like if you was looking at something, right, your face is slightly in shade. if that helps some people that still didn't quite understand it at this point. Okay, so that is the most pinnacle and the most useful thing to understand in rendering. I feel like it makes the most difference if you understand these things. It's a little bit complicated, but once you understand shading, that's 80% of your rendering job done for you. You know, last episode we looked at how to actually build up our three-dimensional comprehension and to render things in the third dimension. This episode we're looking at more how to actually imagine how the lighting of those forms works for yourself. So if you remember last episode, we was talking about, you know, painting still lifes from reference. This is what's going to happen when we paint still lifes and we try to paint them from imagination. So to practice this, what I recommend is, if you look at the last episode when I was talking about painting things, as I just said, but I was talking about painting things in a small amount of pixels and doing actual studies. I would continue doing those kinds of studies, but once you move into imagination, into the territory of imagining things, obviously you're going to study what shading's doing when you're doing from reference, but once you start moving into imagination, that's where you're going to need this understanding of how the light works, and how shading works is going to be a bulk of that. And please do remember that shading is not a simulation like lighting. It is purely a geometric principle, and that's why it's much easier to understand. I would say it's still kind of complicated, but it's much easier to kind of simulate in your mind than lighting is, because it's not really as much of a simulation. It just gets the bulk of the work done in a generalized manner. Okay? So I'm going to stop going on about this now. I hope I explained all of that okay. And I'll probably have more goes in future. But yeah, that is the most important area, shading, other than actually working in three-dimensional and have in the third dimension and having three-dimensional comprehension and knowing how to stage stuff and model and sculpt. Other than that, once you actually get into rendering, this shading, this is what's going to do the bulk of the work for you, especially in your imaginative drawing. And like I said, watch my other video on how I recommended to study things in lower amounts of pixels. Try and do a few things, at least a few things from reference, and see how this shading works in real life, or you know, from like a very decent 3D renders, and try to separate what those shading principles are, and then kind of, you know, move into your territory of imagination. And if that's what you want to do, if that's what your goal is, then you can move into trying to imagine things and simulating things in your head. And this shading is where to start. Next time, I'm not sure if we'll talk about lighting, but just whenever we do talk about lighting, that is, as I said, going to be more about simulating. And as I mentioned, like ping pong balls earlier, there's many different ways you can kind of imagine the lighting. But you're basically doing the same job as a computer there. This is the much simpler way. This is a layer underneath lighting. So shading always exists. You can kind of do shading. You can get something that's only had shading done to it, right? So if I look at something this is completely shaded, but there's no lighting, right? Once I add the lighting on top of it, what I'm basically doing is, like I just said, it only affects it on top of it. So what's going to happen is the lighting is just going to be like this specular reflection, or if it's slightly transparent, maybe there's some light going through it, or maybe there's some what's it called, subsurface scattering, whatever the hell that is, whatever the hell you want to add to it, sorry. That's what's going to be lighting. It's going to be a layer on top. Alright, so as I said I would a few seconds ago, I'm going to shut up now and sign out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.